A missing man is found murdered in Schenectady, New York.
Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen. He had at least 2 ligature marks around his neck.
This was a homicide. He died by strangulation.
His loved ones claim he didn't have enemies.
He was nurturing and caring.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal.
I said, something's up, more than meets the eye here.
But the clues point detectives to the last people anyone would have expected.
They got together and said, we got to get rid of him.
He was in love with her and wanted to end a toxic marriage so that they could be together.
She manipulated this whole thing. She was the puppet master.
November 23rd, 1995. It's Thanksgiving Day in Schenectady, New York. But instead of celebrating with her family, 30-year-old Stella Lacy is calling police to report her husband, Paul Lacy, missing.
She had seen Paul the previous evening. She went up to bed around 11:30. Paul was downstairs rummaging around the kitchen for something to eat and never came up to bed, which was not unusual. He would sleep on a couch or a day bed on the first floor or go out late, but not coming home that night or the next day was unusual because it was Thanksgiving Day.
It was very odd that Uncle Paul wouldn't be at Thanksgiving. You know, his life revolved around family.
The Schenectady Police Department dispatched somebody to her house to conduct an initial interview.
Officers ask Stella to walk them through the day leading up to Paul's disappearance.
She told the patrolman that Paul had worked Thanksgiving Eve during the day. Ron Faulkner, who was Paul's first cousin, was actually living in the house and had been renting a room from the Lacys. When Paul got home from work, she sent Ron and Paul out to get some bread for the stuffing and a couple other items. And she continued to make Thanksgiving dinner.
Stella says Paul and Ron returned from the store around 11 p.m.
There was a neighbor who lived kitty corner to the Lacey's home. His name was Calvin Smith. And at this time, he stopped over and just to socialize with Ron and Paul, and she went up to bed.
Paul doesn't come to bed that night. The next morning, she believes he may have left to go to work. She had paged him. He doesn't come back. And that's what precipitates her initial filing of the missing persons report.
To go missing on Thanksgiving, it hit us all hard because it's like, we know Paul and he always come home. So this was abnormal.
It's not even 24 hours, but if someone's reported missing, they're put into a national database. In this case, there was a vehicle involved, his 1986 Volvo with a New York plate on it. All this is entered into a database.
The patrol officer asked for a recent photo of her husband, Paul, and if there was any extenuating circumstances that she should know about.
She said he was not a drug user, but Paul was under a lot of pressure. They had some money issues. He lost his job. Even though he got a new job at a local Coca-Cola warehouse, you know, they owed a lot of money. Additionally, she said he recently cashed out his 401k for about $8,000, but Paul wouldn't leave the family and the kids on a holiday. At this point, patrolmen interviewed neighbors, but we really didn't get any good leads.
His devotion to his family makes the disappearance even harder to explain. 2 days into the investigation, a tip comes in.
At about 2:30 p.m., the Schenectady Police Department gets a call from a person living 2.5 blocks from where the Lacys lived, saying that there was a car parked on a one-way street in front of their house, parked the wrong way.
There was a man sleeping in the car. The officers that responded made numerous attempts, pounding on the glass, knocking on the side of the car, and they felt that it was necessary to call for EMS.
They opened the door and tried to wake this person up. Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen.
They found no wallet, but they did find, by going through his pockets, an identification card. Then the police knew that this was Paul Lacy.
Paul Lacy was born May 12, 1964, in Albany, New York. He and his younger sister were part of a large extended family.
He was a loving brother. We always were watching cartoons. He used to take me to school. I was littler than him, so I walked slower, so I was pretty much led around, you know.
We had very strong mothers, and then it turned us into decent people.
Paul was always a happy kid. He always enjoyed life. Anything that he did, it was done because of his doing. What made him happy, that's what he did. Paul's father wasn't really in his life. I had to depend on the welfare system, but I was always going to take care of my kids.
After high school in the early 80s, Paul started working at a local market. He quickly rose to become a manager. It was also the place he met his future wife, Stella Close.
Stella and her family was in our neighborhood. Her dad was a hardworking man. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom, for what I could tell. So Stella had a stable home. She had dated a couple guys that were not as nice as Paul. He was nurturing and caring. He wanted to have somebody to love. She started coming around. And then next thing you know, they're getting married.
The young couple married in 1986. In the years that followed, Paul and Stella built a life together, including 3 beautiful children.
He decided to go into his career at Cargill, which is a flour mill at the Port of Albany.
Pretty much any job you got that was down at the Port of Albany, they paid you well.
Whatever his wife, Stella, wanted, he made it for her or got it for her. And it started with a car. Then he bought her a house, had a pool put in. He provided everything for that family.
And you know how it feels to not have a real father that you've been longing for. Therefore, you're going to be a stand-up man, and he decided to be that stand-up guy for his family.
Paul strove to be the best father he could be for his children, ages 9, 7, and 16 months.
Paul had 3 kids, a girl, a boy, a girl. That's what Paul wanted. His heart was kind. He would always make sure whoever he did for, he was going to do his best by him. He didn't care who you was.
As far as Paul, his aspirations, each one was just a milestone. It became setting up for retirement, setting up for his children's education. So, yeah, his goals kept getting higher and higher.
But 2 days after Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Paul has been found deceased. At first glance, it's unclear how he died.
The keys were on the floor in the front seat. There was no broken glass anywhere. His clothes weren't disheveled like there was a struggle. There was no blood. There was no gunshots. There was no knife wounds.
While there are no obvious wounds on Paul's body, closer inspection reveals a telltale sign of foul play.
He had at least 2 rounds of ligature marks around his neck. He was strangled.
There isn't much room in the back seat of this car, this Volvo. So it would have been very difficult for whoever killed Paul to have strangled him from the back seat.
That would tell me it took a person of size and or strength to pull this off, and that it wasn't done in his car, it was done elsewhere, and then Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene.
Strangulation is not a typical means of death in a robbery case. People who strangle other people usually have a personal relationship. It could have been by someone who was close to him.
Coming up, investigators learn about a recent feud.
Paul put his foot down and said no. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
And a possible suspect shifts the course of the investigation.
I said, we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here.
Two days after Paul Lacy was reported missing, his dead body has been found less than 3 blocks away from home. And investigators are trying to determine why.
There was no jewelry on him at that time, although he was known to wear 3 rings, which he did not have on. His pockets and his black jeans were turned inside out. It could be construed as a robbery gone bad or a robbery/murder. And the fact that Stella said that he carried a large amount of money on him at all times would point to that fact for sure. The only thing that they found was a pager on his belt. They downloaded the pager information. Stella told the responding officers that she did try paging him and he didn't respond. So it pretty much corroborated Stella's story.
After assisting the forensics people from the state police, it was determined that the body was going to be removed from the vehicle and would be shipped for autopsy. Then, investigators made the notification right away.
We asked Stella to come to the police department. She was given what is essentially a death notification. She started crying, seemed very upset. When she settled down, we said, now you need to help us help you and find out what happened to Paul. She's traumatized at this point. We found her husband dead. She's got 3 children. If she makes a mistake in a statement, we're going to let it go. But we do find some inconsistencies with what she tells us versus what she told the responding patrolman to report him missing. She said she saw him eat a salami sandwich at 11:30, which she did not tell the responding officers initially. She also said that Paul came up to bed on Thanksgiving Eve and got in bed with her, that he wanted to have sex, but she turned him down. Even though there was inconsistencies, we have to take that into consideration. Emotions, finite details that she may or may not have forgotten. So we don't push her on that, because you don't want to paint her in a corner yet until we know more.
This time, when Stella describes the events leading up to Paul's disappearance, she leaves out mention of their neighbor Calvin. But she has another theory about who might be involved.
As far as she knew, he never cheated on her, and she stated she never cheated on him, other than some financial pressures that they were under. On the surface, they had a good marriage. But Stella said that he did have an ongoing feud with a first cousin by the name of David Womack, who actually lived with them for a few months.
His older cousin needed him, and he provided a place for him, where the other family members were like, no, you're not staying with us. Paul was the one that was kind-hearted.
Stella says the arrangement quickly turned sour. And on November 3rd, 3 weeks before Paul's body was discovered, the conflict between the cousins escalated.
David would get into these rage-type arguments, stuff like that. He always had guns and stuff. But Paul was not like that. Paul wasn't a physical fighter. David Womack had an issue with his anger. So he probably thought he could bully Paul and stay there. Well, Paul put his foot down and said no. Told him he had to go. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
Paul kicked him out of the house. And according to Paul Lacy, his cousin Dave Womack sliced tires on Paul's cars.
While David was never charged in the tire slashing incident, Paul's allegations pushed their relationship to a breaking point.
Paul Lacy kicked his cousin Womack out of the house, but he allowed another cousin, Ron Faulkner, to rent a room in the house.
Investigators tracked David down for an interview.
Of course, he denied any involvement and said he hadn't seen Paul in quite a while. And in fact, definitely he didn't see Paul Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving.
David claims he went hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day.
That was corroborated by friends and family alike. Although he was very suspect at this point, his alibi was corroborated.
With David ruled out as a possible suspect, detectives hope Paul's autopsy will give them a new lead.
The ligature marks left bruising and a distinctive pattern around his neck.
The medical examiner had determined that, in fact, this was a homicide. It was further determined that Mr. Lacy had died by strangulation caused by ligature.
This is not an exact science in terms of time of death. The fact that Paul had been, quote-unquote, frozen because of the weather and actually had been dead for some time, the ME cannot put, days on it. So we had to rely on the stomach contents and statement of Stella saying he ate a salami sandwich at 11:30 at night, Thanksgiving Eve. But Paul's stomach was empty, which would indicate that he hadn't eaten.
One of the last people to see him alive says that he is eating a sandwich or having a meal. The autopsy report is inconsistent with that. At this point, they're highly skeptical of those initial reports.
We still had a lot of unanswered questions. And now that Stella may or may not be involved, the pressure's on us to find other physical evidence or real evidence or eyewitnesses. But Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene. Like, where did this actually happen?
Investigators have received Paul Lacy's autopsy report, which contradicts his wife Stella Lacy's story. But with little evidence to go on, police can't be certain of anything. They know the answers they seek likely depend on finding where the murder took place.
Well, how about his house? That's where he's supposed to be. And the last time Stella saw him, Getting a search warrant's a pretty heavy lift, and it takes time. So we asked Stella for consent to search. Paul's first cousin, Ron, who lived there, they both consented. There's investigators throughout the house, upstairs, downstairs, in bedrooms and bathrooms and closets, drawers, private places. And at one point, while I was there, a man just walked into the back door into the kitchen. Didn't knock. We nodded to each other, said hello, and he immediately went to the turkey, the Thanksgiving turkey, ripped off a leg, started eating it, and I said, who are you? And he said that he was a neighbor, identified himself as Calvin Smith.
Calvin Smith was another man who was in the house that night that Paul Lacy disappeared. Stella neglected to mention that Calvin was there in her second interview with the police.
He said, yeah, this is really sad about what happened to Paul. I said, yeah, but we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here. They certainly got my attention. And I said, what do you mean by that? He shrugged his shoulders. He was just as calm, cool, and collected as could be. He's eating a leg off a turkey dinner. And I took note of that. And I said, something's up. More than meets the eye here. You know, again, it's common sense. The speculation is that it happened here. I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on him right then because we didn't know, was he involved? Was someone in the house involved? So I just let it go. But of course, I told the rest of the team.
After concluding their search, investigators' suspicions are reinforced by another tip.
There was an anonymous call that came in that the origin was never identified, but indicated that Paul Lacy had very poor eyesight and needed to wear his glasses all the time.
After we got that phone call from a friend, we immediately, started thinking, where are the glasses? There were no glasses in the car. So that tells you pretty much that he didn't drive there where he was found.
At that point, investigation goes back to the last place where he was seen alive with his wife, Ron Faulkner, and Calvin Smith.
We decided that we need to talk to Ron, Calvin, and Stella for the third time and bring them into the police department to talk to individually. They weren't under arrest, but we had a plan. We're going to interview them separately and be able to pull apart their stories or corroborate their stories. If someone's lying, it's hard to keep up a lie, and one lie leads to another. The inconsistencies that may or may not have meant something early on come into focus a lot more when you add them up. One or all of them are involved, and it did happen in the house.
Coming up, detectives expose a marriage in distress.
She finally admits, I've been having an affair. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary.
And a shocking confession turns the case upside down.
She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
On November 27, 1995, 2 days after Paul Lacy was found murdered in the backseat of his car, investigators attempt to verify his final moments with the 3 people who saw him last. Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, his friend Calvin Smith, and his cousin, Ronald Faulkner.
We start by interviewing Stella. I can tell that she's nervous now. She's got a whole different demeanor. And she knows that Ron and Calvin are being talked to in adjacent rooms.
Contrary to what she initially told police, Stella admits she and Paul were having problems.
The marriage wasn't as rosy as she initially painted a picture of, and that Paul always wanted sex, and that was something she wasn't willing to participate in as much as he wanted to. He was a free spender, and they had filed Chapter 13 to protect the house and their vehicles, but he was spending money, according to her, hand over fist.
Stella says she began spending more time with Paul's cousin, Ron.
Ron, took care of a lot of chores around the house, was Uncle Ron to the 3 kids.
She told police that Ron was a breath of fresh air and could talk to her and she could talk to him and he would listen, unlike Paul.
She finally admits, in fact, she says, I've been having an affair with Ron for about a year. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary. I asked her if she loved Ron, and she said actually she didn't, but house-wise, it was a good thing for him to be there for babysitting, cleaning, chores, etc. But it was just like a convenience. In terms of motive, she's having an affair with Paul's first cousin, Ron, who's living in the home and had been there for about 6 or 7 months. Secondly, there's a money issue. And she finally admits that Paul had 2 life insurance policies worth $50,000.
Stella admits that over time, she and Ron began to fantasize about life without her husband.
She told me that both her and Ron disliked Paul and even hated him. And they talked about getting rid of Paul.
Stella said she never thought that was being taken seriously.
But Stella says on Thanksgiving Eve, Ron surprised her.
She went up to bed. Paul came up a short time after and got in bed, wanted to have sex with her. She turned him down, and they were in bed for the night. Within a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or so, she said that Ron yelled upstairs.
Ron yelled up the stairs that Paul had a phone call, and he suggested Paul come down and take the call. According to Stella, he was only gone a few minutes, and then Ron went back up the stairs and asked Stella to come down.
She walked in the room and just saw Paul face down in Ron's bedroom with a pink blanket over his head.
In the room besides Ron was Calvin Smith, the neighbor that had been over to the house that evening. She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
They said, we got to get rid of him. She went back upstairs, got his shoes, pants, shirt, his belt, his pager, dressed him, all 3 of them, because it's not easy to dress a dead body. Calvin and Ron loaded Paul in the back seat of his Volvo. Stella said, I'll stay here and clean up the mess. She also said that Calvin had the rope they used to strangle him and told Calvin to get rid of the rope. And she told me that he flushed it down the toilet.
After they lowered Paul's body in the back seat, Ron drove the car. And he drove the car a couple of blocks away.
The 3 of them got together and said, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure our stories match. And the biggest thing was that we're going to say it looked like a robbery. Here's Paul's 3 rings, which they removed from his hand after they killed him, and the money out of his pockets. Stella said, I'll wait till tomorrow to report Paul missing, and I'll beep him several times throughout the day so the police will think that I was really worried about him, that everything's going to be fine.
Stella's confession seems to explain everything, but detectives sense she is downplaying her involvement.
I don't know how true her confession is or not. I've got enough to believe that she's telling the truth to a point, but we need to talk to Ron and Calvin and put their stories together and see how close they are matching.
Coming up, the grisly details of the murder come to light.
He said, all right, I did it. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that.
And a confessed killer describes Paul's last moments.
He kisses Paul on the forehead and tells him, I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace.
New York authorities are investigating the strangulation death of Paul Lacy. While his wife, Stella Lacy, is naming her husband's cousin and neighbor in his murder, detectives are in other rooms with the two men trying to get their versions of the story.
I found out that Calvin was not admitting to anything, so I said, let me try. He denied being involved at all, so I asked him if he put his hands on the rope, and he said he did not. I said, Calvin, do you know what a rope is made of? And he kind of said, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, it's made of fibers. If you touch that rope, you're gonna have these fibers embedded in your hand. Well, this is definitely not true, but Calvin seemed to be believing me. I told him that the PD had just purchased a fiber detection instrument. Now, this is 1995. Copy machines were brand new, big piece of equipment. Schenectady PD had purchased one recently, so I took him out of the interview room and I told him that was the fiber detection instrument. I lifted up the cover, as you would place a piece of paper there, and I said, we're gonna stick your hand in that and we're gonna hit the detection button, or whatever I called it. And he put his hand down. You know, the bright light comes on. I said, don't look at the light. He pulled his hand away.
The investigator's ruse has the intended effect.
Right there at the copy machine, he said, all right, I did it. I strangled Paul. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that. I felt bad for Calvin that I had tricked him, but I can do that. I didn't interfere with his right to due process or convince an innocent person to confess to something he didn't do, all within the guidelines of the law.
According to Calvin, Stella wasn't an innocent bystander. He says he went along with the murder because she promised to give him $100 up front, along with a cut from the insurance payout.
Stella said, I'm going to give you some money. He thought maybe this is life-changing money. They also took the rings off Paul's fingers.
Calvin thought he'd get a lot of money for those 3 rings, and instead, all he got for the total for the 3 rings was $40.
When they question Ron Faulkner, he confesses as well, but with a different motive than Calvin.
He was in love with Stella and wanted to end a toxic relationship in the marriage so that they could be together.
Ron knew that her relationship with Paul was not what she wanted.
Ron said he'd do anything to make Stella happy. So while he was out running errands with Paul and Calvin the night before Thanksgiving, he decided to make the fantasy a reality.
Ron said, here's what we're going to do. Calvin, you get the rope, because you're a big guy, and you can hide behind my bedroom door. I'm going to yell up to Paul. When he comes in, you put that rope around him twice and just pull as hard as you can. Which by Calvin's account and Ron's account, this is how it went down. Calvin just pulled as hard as he could for a couple minutes, and Ron actually jumped on top of Calvin to put more weight on Paul.
As he's dying, Ron leans forward, kisses Paul on the forehead, and tells him, "I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace."
Paul's body was found on Saturday, November 25th. 3 days later, Ron, Calvin, and Stella were arrested. All three were charged with murder, tampering with evidence, conspiracy.
While they all face the same charges, investigators believe Stella was the driving force behind the crime.
Stella, I think, manipulated them both into doing it. She was the puppet master.
I was shocked that Calvin, Ronald, and Stella had murdered my brother over insurance money with Stella. Anything she wanted, my brother would have gave it to her. It was senseless that she would even go to those extremes.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money.
Paul's family relies on prosecutors to exact justice. But when it comes to Stella, they have major concerns.
Although I think Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it. We have to make sure we did our job and the evidence is enough to take it to trial. You build the best case, because you're going to get one shot at this.
In August 1996, Stella Lacy goes on trial for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy. Her alleged co-conspirators decide to take plea deals instead.
Ronald and Calvin, they were facing a potential death penalty case. And sure, their attorneys advised them that their only shot to save their own skin by pleading to the lesser murder charges rather than face potential death penalty.
Calvin pled guilty to first-degree murder, was sentenced to 25 to life. Ron decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder and also received 25 to life.
As part of his agreement, Calvin provides testimony against Stella. Prosecutors do not require the same of Ron.
He was in love with her and would never harm her.
Stella's demeanor during the trial was cold, very cold, stone-faced.
The defense strategy was that she did not participate in the murder, only became aware of it after the fact when Ron and Calvin notify her, and that her involvement was to help dispose of the body.
However, Calvin denies such claims. He testifies that Stella was the one that told him Paul's death needed to look like a robbery. He also claims that Stella wanted it to happen before the holiday.
Calvin indicated Stella had tried to do some pre-planning and that her representation that she was totally insulated from the actual homicide was incorrect.
Paul's cousin David Womack takes the stand as a witness. He testifies that Stella not only knew about the murder, she was the one who planned it.
His testimony was that he was approached by Stella and offered $10,000 to kill Paul.
Womack's statement shows that Stella had thought about this in advance.
But it doesn't seem to be enough for the jury.
Womack's credibility was terrible. He never reported to police that she had approached him, so, it looked like sour grapes on his part. The jury didn't believe his testimony. She was actually found not guilty of first-degree murder.
She was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution.
She was sentenced 10 to 32 years in state prison.
The first reaction was upset, anger. We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us.
I feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else because this was all her plan.
Of course, I was disappointed. I take that as a loss. We did our job. I think she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough, I think, for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life.
Paul did not deserve to have his life taken away because of somebody's greed. He deserved better, and he didn't get that.
Paul had an infectious smile. He had a hug that would warm you to the bone. His generosity was unlimited. We still talk about him today. 30 years later, we keep him alive in our heart.
With Paul, it's like, I know he's safe. I don't have to worry about him. And that's the way I go forward with my life.
In the tranquil, family-oriented community of Schenectady, New York, the crisp air of late autumn 1995 usually heralded a season of togetherness and gratitude. Families prepared to gather, sharing meals and creating cherished memories. But for the Lacy family, the arrival of Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 1995, brought with it a chilling harbinger of sorrow, an unfolding nightmare that would irrevocably shatter their world. 30-year-old Stella Lacy placed a distressed call to the local police department, her voice a mix of anxiety and bewilderment, to report her husband, Paul Lacy, missing. Stella recounted the previous evening's events to the responding officers. She explained that she had retired to bed around 11:30 on Thanksgiving Eve. Paul, ever the diligent provider, had returned home from his daytime shift, and after his usual routine, he was downstairs, presumably rummaging in the kitchen for a late-night bite to eat. It was not entirely uncommon for Paul to opt to sleep on a couch or a daybed on the first floor, or even occasionally go out late, so his immediate absence from their marital bed did not initially trigger alarm. However, as the hours of Thanksgiving Day dwindled and then passed, with no sign of Paul returning home, his prolonged absence became deeply unsettling. This was Thanksgiving, a day sacrosanct for family, a principle Paul held in the highest esteem. His life, as his loved ones later affirmed, revolved around his family. To be absent on such a significant holiday was not merely unusual, it was profoundly abnormal, entirely uncharacteristic of the loving and devoted man they all knew. The Schenectady Police Department promptly dispatched an officer to the Lacy residence to conduct an initial interview. Stella guided the patrolman through the day leading up to Paul's disappearance. She confirmed that Paul had indeed worked Thanksgiving Eve during the day. Living within their home, renting a room, was Paul's first cousin, Ron Faulkner. On that pivotal evening, Stella had sent both Paul and Ron out to procure some essential items, specifically bread for the Thanksgiving stuffing, along with a couple of other groceries, while she remained at home, meticulously continuing her preparations for the festive dinner. According to Stella, Paul and Ron returned from the store sometime around 11 o'clock that night. Adding another layer to the evening-s narrative, a neighbor, Calvin Smith, who resided kitty-corner to the Lacy home, dropped by simply to socialize with Ron and Paul. After this brief interaction, Stella again ascended to bed, leaving the men downstairs. The next morning, Paul's side of the bed remained empty. Stella initially rationalized his absence, speculating that he might have left early for work. She attempted to reach him by paging him repeatedly throughout the day, a hopeful gesture that yielded no response. It was this unnerving silence, coupled with the profound anomaly of his absence on Thanksgiving, that precipitated her urgent call to file the missing persons report. The news of Paul going missing on Thanksgiving struck his entire family deeply, a collective gasp of disbelief rippling through their closely knit unit. Paul was renowned for his unwavering commitment to his home and his kin. His not being present for Thanksgiving was a glaring, alarming deviation from his predictable and cherished routine. Even though less than 24 hours had elapsed, once a person is reported missing, their details are immediately entered into a national database. In Paul's case, specific information about his 1986 Volvo with New York license plates was also added to the critical national registry. During the initial police interview, the patrol officer requested a recent photograph of Paul and inquired about any extenuating circumstances Stella believed they should be aware of. Stella assured him that Paul was not involved with illegal substances. However, she candidly disclosed that Paul had been under considerable pressure recently, primarily due to financial difficulties. He had, she admitted, lost his previous employment, though he had swiftly secured a new position at a local Coca-Cola warehouse. Despite this new employment, the couple faced significant debt. Furthermore, she revealed that Paul had recently cashed out his 401k, an amount totaling approximately $8,000. Despite these monetary stresses, Stella emphatically stated that Paul would never abandon his family and their 3 young children, especially not on a holiday. At this early stage, patrolmen interviewed various neighbors in the vicinity, but these inquiries regrettably did not yield any substantial leads. Paul's profound devotion to his family, a trait consistently underscored by everyone who knew him, only served to render his disappearance even more bewildering and difficult to rationalize. 2 agonizing days into the nascent investigation, a crucial tip surfaced, piercing through the shroud of uncertainty. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the Schenectady Police Department received a call from a vigilant resident living Diuetetu and a half blocks from the Lacy home. The caller reported an anomalous sight. A car parked on a one-way street directly in front of their house, conspicuously facing the wrong direction. Compounding the oddity, a man appeared to be sleeping inside. The officers who swiftly responded to the scene made numerous attempts to rouse the individual, pounding on the car's glass windows and knocking forcefully on its side. When their efforts proved fruitless, They determined it was necessary to summon emergency medical services. Upon opening the car door and trying again to wake the man, a grim discovery was made. Not only was he unmistakably deceased, but his body was also nearly frozen, a testament to the unforgiving chill of the late November weather. While no wallet was immediately found, a thorough search of his pockets yielded an identification card. It was then that the officers identified the deceased man as Paul Lacy. Paul Lacy was born on May 12, 1964, in the city of Albany, New York. He and his younger sister were nurtured within a large extended family network, forging deep and enduring bonds. His sister fondly recalled him as a loving brother, reminiscing about shared childhood joys like watching cartoons. She remembered how, being smaller, she walked slower, and Paul would patiently lead her around, a tangible representation of his caring nature. Their upbringing, shaped by strong, resolute mothers, instilled in them decent, principled values. Paul, by all accounts, was an inherently happy child, consistently embracing life with a cheerful spirit. Whatever endeavor he pursued, he did so with genuine enthusiasm, motivated by his own innate desire for happiness. His father, unfortunately, was not a significant presence in his life, leaving his mother to navigate the welfare system while demonstrating an unwavering commitment to raising her children well. After completing high school in the early 1980s, Paul embarked on his professional journey, securing employment at a local market. His dedication and competence quickly propelled him through the ranks, eventually ascending to a managerial position. It was within the bustling aisles of this market that he encountered his future wife, Stella Close. Stella and her family hailed from the same neighborhood. Her father was characterized as a hardworking man, and her mother, from what could be gathered, was a stay-at-home parent, suggesting Stella grew up in a stable household environment. Prior to meeting Paul, Stella had dated a few individuals who, by comparison, were not as kind or nurturing. Paul, with his inherently caring and gentle disposition, represented a welcome change. He yearned to cherish and provide for someone. Stella began to frequent the market, and soon their acquaintance blossomed into a relationship that culminated in marriage in 1986. In the ensuing years, Paul and Stella meticulously built a life together. A partnership blessed with the joyous arrival of 3 beautiful children, a daughter, a son, and another daughter, aged 9, 7, and 16 months, respectively. These children were Paul's deepest desire, the very essence of his ambition. Paul made a pivotal career move, transitioning to Cargill, a prominent flour mill located at the Port of Albany. Employment at the Port of Albany was known for offering substantial compensation, reflecting Paul's commitment to financially supporting his burgeoning family. He was described as a man who would spare no effort to fulfill Stella's wishes, providing her with everything she desired, from a car to a comfortable house, complete with a swimming pool. He poured his very essence into providing for his family, driven by a deep-seated desire to be the kind of stand-up man and father he himself had yearned for in his own youth. His heart was exceptionally kind. He consistently ensured that anyone he helped received his best, regardless of their background or status. Paul's aspirations were not static. Each accomplishment served as a milestone towards higher goals. He meticulously planned for retirement and diligently saved for his children's education, his objectives steadily growing grander and more ambitious. Yet, just 2 days after that fateful Thanksgiving Day in 1995, Paul was found deceased. Initially, the precise manner of his death remained ambiguous. The car keys lay on the front seat floorboard, with no broken glass indicating forced entry, and Paul S. clothes showed no signs of being disheveled, suggesting an absence of struggle. There was no visible blood, no gunshot wounds, nor any knife injuries. However, a closer, more meticulous examination of Paul S.'s body revealed a telling sign of foul play. He bore at least 2 distinct rounds of ligature marks encircling his neck, undeniable evidence that he had been strangled. The cramped confines of the Volvo's back seat would have made it exceedingly difficult for someone to strangle him from that position, suggesting that the act would have required a person of considerable size and/or strength. This physical limitation within the vehicle also strongly indicated that the strangulation had not occurred within the car itself, but rather at another location, and Paul's body subsequently transported and placed there. Strangulation, unlike deaths in typical robbery scenarios, often implies a deeply personal connection between the victim and the perpetrator. It suggested the involvement of someone intimately acquainted with Paul. As investigators delved deeper, they would soon uncover a recent feud and a potential suspect, which dramatically shifted the trajectory of their investigation. A detective recalling V.K. hot certainty that the bottom starts right here. Paul Lacy's deceased body had been discovered less than 3 blocks from his home, igniting a fervent determination within the investigative team to ascertain the exact circumstances and motive behind this tragic loss of life. At the scene, officers noted the absence of jewelry on Paul S.'s person, despite his known habit of wearing 3 rings. His black jeans had pockets turned inside out, and detail that could readily be construed as evidence of a robbery gone awry, or perhaps a robbery escalating into murder. This theory was further bolstered by Stella's earlier statement that Paul typically carried a significant amount of cash with him at all times. The only item found on him was a pager, clipped to his belt. The information stored on the pager was meticulously downloaded, and it revealed multiple attempts by Stella to page him, a detail that initially seemed to corroborate her story of frantic worry. Following the thorough assistance of forensics personnel from the state police, Paul S.'s body was carefully removed from the vehicle and subsequently transported for autopsy. With confirmation of death, investigators moved quickly to notify Stella Lacy. She was requested to come to the police department, where she received the agonizing news. Her reaction was immediate and profound. She collapsed into tears, appearing genuinely devastated. Once she had composed herself somewhat, the officers, recognizing her immense trauma, the shock of her husband's death, and the immediate implications for her 3 young children, gently impressed upon her the critical need for her cooperation. Their purpose, they emphasized, was to help her uncover what had befallen Paul. While empathetic to her emotional state and prepared to overlook minor inaccuracies, should they arise from her trauma, they began to notice certain inconsistencies when comparing her current account with the details she had provided to the responding patrolmen who initially took her missing person S report. For instance, during this subsequent interview, Stella stated she had seen Paul eat a salami sandwich at most 11:30 on Thanksgiving Eve, a detail she had not shared with the initial officers. Furthermore, she now claimed Paul had actually come to bed on Thanksgiving Eve, where he expressed a desire for intimacy, which she had politely declined. Despite these emergent inconsistencies, the investigators decided against pressing her immediately. They had to consider the profound emotional impact of the tragedy and the possibility of her genuinely forgetting finite details. Rushing her, or painting her into a corner prematurely, would be counterproductive especially until more concrete evidence emerged. Significantly, in this later interview, Stella omitted any mention of their neighbor Calvin Smith having been present at their home on Thanksgiving Eve. Instead, she offered the police a different theory, suggesting another individual who might be involved. Stella maintained that, to her knowledge, Paul had never been unfaithful, and she asserted the same for herself. Their marriage, on the surface, appeared sound, aside from the financial strains they were enduring. However, Stella revealed that Paul had an ongoing feud with a first cousin named David Womack, who had actually resided with them for several months. Paul, in his characteristic kind-heartedness, had offered David a place to stay when other family members had declined, embodying his nature as a genuinely compassionate individual. Yet, Stella claimed the arrangement had quickly deteriorated. Approximately 3 weeks before Paul S.'s body was discovered, on November 3rd, the conflict between the cousins reportedly escalated. David, according to Stella, was prone to violent outbursts and owned several firearms. Paul, in stark contrast, was not physically aggressive. He was not a fighter. David Womack's issue, she stressed, lay in his uncontrolled anger. He likely believed he could intimidate Paul and remain in the house indefinitely. However, Paul, for once, stood his ground, firmly telling David he had to leave. This decisive act, Stella recounted, unleashed David's full rage. Following his eviction from the home, David Womack, according to Paul's allegations, retaliated by slashing the tires on Paul's vehicles. While David was never formally charged for this incident, Paul's accusations effectively shattered their already strained relationship. Despite the deep rift with David Womack, Paul's benevolent nature allowed another cousin, Ron Faulkner, to continue renting a room in their home. Investigators, following this new lead, located David Womack for an interview. Naturally, David adamantly denied any involvement in Paul's disappearance or death, stating he had not seen Paul in quite some time, and certainly not on Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving Day itself. David asserted he had gone hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day, an alibi that was thoroughly corroborated by several friends and family members. Although David Womack initially presented as highly suspicious due to the prior altercation, his alibi proved to be robust. With David effectively ruled out as a viable suspect, detectives turned their hopes towards Paul's forthcoming autopsy report, anticipating it might provide a fresh and critical lead. The medical examiner's report confirmed the initial observations. The ligature marks left clear bruising and a distinctive pattern around Paul's neck. The medical examiner definitively concluded that this was, in fact, a homicide specifically determined to be death by ligature strangulation. However, accurately determining the precise time of death in such cases is not an exact science. The fact that Paul had been found nearly frozen due to the cold weather, having been deceased for an indeterminate period, prevented the medical examiner from establishing a precise timeline in terms of specific days. Consequently, investigators had to rely on other forms of evidence, primarily Paul's stomach contents and Stella's statement about him eating a salami sandwich at 11:30 on Thanksgiving Eve. Yet, a critical piece of information from the autopsy contradicted Stella's narrative. Paul's stomach was empty. An empty stomach would unequivocally indicate that he had not consumed food recently. The story provided by one of the last people to claim they saw him alive, that he was eating a sandwich or a meal, now stood in stark opposition to the autopsy findings. At this juncture, the initial reports were viewed with intense skepticism. The detectives recognized they were still grappling with a multitude of unanswered questions. The inconsistencies in Stella S. statements, combined with the forensic evidence, meant her potential involvement was now a serious consideration. The pressure mounted on the investigative team to uncover further physical evidence, reliable eyewitness accounts, or any concrete lead. The reality that Paul's body had been moved from the actual crime scene remained a formidable obstacle, begging the fundamental question: where did this horrific act actually take place? Having received Paul Lacy's autopsy report, which dramatically contradicted his wife, Stella Lacy's earlier account, the police were confronted with a renewed sense of urgency. Despite the compelling nature of the medical examiner's findings, without more concrete evidence, they could not definitively assert any conclusions. The answers they desperately sought, they reasoned, likely hinged upon pinpointing the actual location where the murder transpired. Their immediate, logical instinct led them to consider the most plausible site: Paul's own home, the place where Stella claimed she had last seen him alive. Securing a search warrant for a private residence, however, is a rigorous legal undertaking, requiring substantial justification and valuable time. Therefore, they opted for a more direct approach, seeking consent to search from Stella. Crucially, Paul's first cousin, Ron, who also resided in the house, provided his consent as well, streamlining the investigative process. Investigators fanned out across the Lacy home, meticulously scrutinizing every inn. Upstairs, downstairs, bedrooms, bathrooms, closets, drawers, and all private spaces, leaving no stone unturned in their exhaustive search for clues. During this intensive search, a man unexpectedly walked through the back door and into the kitchen without knocking. He exchanged a brief nod and a greeting with the officers present before immediately proceeding to the Thanksgiving turkey, tearing off a leg and beginning to eat it. Intrigued, an investigator inquired about his identity. The man calmly identified himself as Calvin Smith, revealing he was a neighbor. The name instantly resonated. Calvin Smith was the very neighbor whom Stella had failed to mention in her second police interview as having been present in the house on the night Paul Lacy disappeared. Calvin, appearing entirely composed, expressed his sorrow regarding Paul's fate. "Yeah," he mused, "this is really sad about what happened to Paul." To this, the investigator responded, "Yeah, but we will get to the bottom of this." In a move that sent a jolt of suspicion through the seasoned officer, Calvin, still holding the turkey leg, casually pointed with his free hand towards the kitchen floor and stated, with an unnerving placidity, "The bottom starts right here." The remark immediately seized the investigator's attention. "What do you mean by that?" he pressed. But Calvin merely shrugged his shoulders, maintaining an almost preternatural calm, cool, and collected demeanor while continuing to eat his turkey leg. This deeply unsettling interaction solidified the investigator's burgeoning suspicions. Something's up, he thought, more than meets the eye here. It was a moment of common-sense intuition, the speculation that the murder had occurred within the confines of that very house grew immeasurably. Choosing not to exert undue pressure on Calvin at that moment, as his direct involvement was still unknown, the investigator allowed the remark to pass without immediate confrontation, but promptly conveyed the unsettling encounter to the rest of his team. Upon concluding their search of the Lacy home, the investigators' suspicions were further solidified by another incoming tip. An anonymous call, the origin of which was never identified, conveyed a critical piece of information. Paul Lacy suffered from very poor eyesight and was reliant on wearing his glasses at all times. This detail immediately sparked a realization within the investigative team. Paul's glasses had not been found in the abandoned Volvo. This crucial absence strongly suggested that Paul had not, in fact, driven himself to the location where his body was discovered. At this point, the investigative focus squarely shifted back to the last known place where Paul was seen alive, with the three individuals present: his wife, Stella Lacy, his first cousin, Ron Faulkner, and his neighbor, Calvin Smith. A strategic decision was made. Stella, Ron, and Calvin needed to be brought into the police department for a third, separate round of interviews. While they were not yet formally under arrest, the detectives had a meticulously crafted plan. Their objective was to interview each individual separately, allowing them to carefully compare and contrast their narratives, to pull apart any inconsistencies, or to corroborate the truths. The underlying principle was clear. Maintaining a complex lie is inherently difficult, and one fabrication inevitably leads to another. The minor inconsistencies that might have seemed insignificant in the early stages now, when accumulated and juxtaposed, would undoubtedly come into sharper focus. The growing conviction within the investigative team was that one, or indeed all, of these individuals were involved, and that the murder had most assuredly taken place within the Lacy residence. The net was tightening, and the truth, though undoubtedly dark, was poised to emerge. On November 27, 1995, precisely 2 days after Paul Lacy's lifeless body was discovered in the back seat of his own car, investigators embarked on the critical task of verifying the final moments of his life. Their focus was fixed on the three individuals who were last known to have seen him alive: Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, his friend, Calvin Smith, and his cousin, Ronald Faulkner. The interrogation began with Stella. A noticeable shift in her demeanor was immediately apparent. Her initial composure had eroded, replaced by a visible nervousness. The gravity of the situation, exacerbated by the knowledge that Ron and Calvin were being questioned in adjacent rooms, weighed heavily upon her. Contrary to her initial, meticulously crafted portrayal of a harmonious marriage, Stella now began to reveal the fissures in her relationship with Paul. She admitted that their union was far from the rosy picture she had painted. Paul, she disclosed, had a strong and consistent desire for physical intimacy, a desire that she was increasingly unwilling to reciprocate. Beyond the emotional distance, financial woes also plagued their marriage. Paul, she recounted, was a free spender, and their inability to manage their expenditures had forced them to file for Chapter 13 bankruptcy to safeguard their home and vehicles. Despite these measures, she felt a constant financial struggle, a relentless hand-over fist battle. In this candid confession, Stella further admitted that she had gradually begun spending more time with Paul's cousin Ron. Ron, she revealed, had seamlessly integrated himself into their household dynamic, assuming many domestic chores and becoming Uncle Ron to their 3 children. She openly shared with the police that Ron represented a breath of fresh air, someone with whom she could converse freely and who would genuinely listen, a stark contrast, she implied, to Paul. The confession escalated dramatically when Stella finally admitted, "Mo've been having an affair with Ron for about a year." She then delivered an astonishing detail. "In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary." When pressed about her feelings for Ron, she frankly stated that she didn't genuinely love him, but rather found his presence convenient. He helped with babysitting, cleaning, and various household chores. He was, in essence, a utilitarian convenience. In terms of discernible motives, the threads began to intertwine. Stella was involved in a clandestine affair with Paul's first cousin, Ron, who had been residing in their home for 6 or 7 months. Secondly, the persistent financial pressures created an atmosphere of strain. And finally, Stella openly conceded that Paul possessed 2 life insurance policies, each valued at $50,000, totaling a significant sum. She further confessed that over time, she and Ron had indulged in the chilling fantasy of a life liberated from Paul's presence. Both her and Ron, she stated, disliked Paul and even hated him, and they talked about getting rid of Paul. Yet, she maintained, she never genuinely believed such morbid discussions were being taken seriously. However, on Thanksgiving Eve, Ron delivered a horrifying surprise. According to Stella, after she had ascended to bed, Paul soon followed, joining her. He expressed his desire for intimacy, which she once again rejected, and they settled into bed for the night. Within a matter of minutes, perhaps 15 or so, Stella recounted, Ron's voice pierced the upstairs silence, yelling that Paul had a phone call. He had even suggested Paul descend the stairs to take the call. Following a brief period, perhaps only a few minutes, Ron again ascended the stairs and urgently summoned Stella to come down. She described walking into Ron's bedroom, a scene that would forever be seared into her memory. Paul was lying face down, a pink blanket draped over his head. Beside Ron in the room was Calvin Smith, the very neighbor who had been present earlier that evening. Stella recalled standing there for several moments, staring, as the chilling realization slowly dawned on her. Paul was dead. The conspirators, faced with the stark reality of their heinous, concluded, "We gotta get rid of him." Stella then retreated upstairs, retrieving Paul's shoes, pants, shirt, his belt, and his pager. All 3 of them, Stella, Ron, and Calvin, then dressed the deceased Paul, a morbid and profoundly difficult task. Calvin and Ron then loaded Paul's body into the back seat of his Volvo. Stella declared her intention to remain at the house and meticulously clean up the gruesome aftermath. She further revealed that Calvin possessed the rope used to strangle Paul and claimed he had disposed of it by flushing it down the toilet. After securing Paul's body in the car, Ron then drove the vehicle a short distance, a couple of blocks away, to the secluded location where it would later be discovered. The 3 co-conspirators, with a chillingly cold precision, meticulously coordinated their narrative. Here's what we going to do. We'll make sure our stories match. And the biggest thing was that we going to say it looked like a robbery. To support this fabrication, Stella kept Paul's 3 rings and any money that had been taken from his pockets. Her final task in the elaborate cover-up was to delay reporting Paul missing until the following day, and then to repeatedly page him throughout the day, fabricating a convincing display of concern for police consumption. Stella's detailed confession, in many ways, appeared to unravel the entire mystery. Yet seasoned detectives, acutely aware of the complexities of criminal psychology, sensed that she might be subtly downplaying her own culpability. While her narrative held enough truth to be credible on its surface, the critical next step involved corroborating and comparing her account with the stories offered by Ron and Calvin. The urgency was palpable. To determine the extent of her involvement and to ensure no details were omitted or skewed, the meticulous investigation into Paul Lacy's strangulation death by New York authorities continued unabated, with Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, having provided a detailed confession, albeit one possibly downplaying her role, and having named her husband's cousin, Ron, and neighbor, Calvin, as co-conspirators. Detectives were simultaneously engaged in other interrogation rooms, assiduously attempting to elicit the men's versions of the horrific events. Initial attempts to interview Calvin yielded nothing. He staunchly denied any involvement whatsoever. Recognizing the impasse, one of the primary investigators decided to directly confront Calvin. Despite Calvin's continued denials regarding the strangulation, the detective strategically pressed, "Calvin, do you know what a rope is made of?" Calvin, seemingly perplexed, mumbled a tentative, "Yeah, mort guess." The detective, seizing the moment, continued, "Well, it's made of fibers. If you touch that rope, you were going to have these fibers embedded in your hand." This statement, while factually sound, was a psychological gambit. The detective then pivoted, presenting another layer to his ruse. He declared that the police department had recently acquired a state-of-the-art fiber detection instrument. In the context of 1995, where complex machinery like photocopiers were still considered significant technological advancements, this claim held a compelling aura of plausibility for someone unfamiliar with the intricate workings of forensic science. The Schenectady Police Department had indeed recently purchased a new copier. The detective led Calvin out of the interview room and into an area where this ordinary copy machine was prominently situated. With a theatrical flourish, the detective lifted the cover of the copier, as if preparing it for a document, and informed Calvin that they were about to hit the detection button, or whatever terminology he concocted for the moment. Calvin, with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant compliance, placed his hand on the copier glass. When the bright light of the copier activated, the detective cautioned, "Don't look at the light!" Startled, Calvin instinctively recoiled, pulling his hand away. It was precisely at that moment, standing before the humble copy machine transformed into a formidable fiber detection instrument, that the facade of Calvin Smith crumbled entirely. "All right," he confessed. "Mort did it. Mort strangled Paul. Mort put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that." The investigator, while feeling a fleeting pang of remorse for the trickery, justified his actions internally, knowing he had not coerced an innocent person into a false confession and had operated strictly within legal and ethical boundaries to obtain the truth. Calvin's subsequent revelations painted a much darker picture of Stella's involvement, directly contradicting her attempts to present herself as a passive, post-factum participant. Calvin revealed he went along with the murder due to a cold, calculated promise. Stella had pledged to pay him $100 up front, along with a significant share from Paul's life insurance payout. He had harbored hopes of life-changing money. Instead, for the 3 rings they stripped from Paul's fingers, which Calvin thought would fetch a substantial sum, he received a mere $40 in total. Shortly thereafter, Ron Faulkner also confessed, though his motive diverged sharply from Calvinist mercenary pursuit. Ron, overcome with a desperate, all-consuming love for Stella, confessed that his primary motivation was to end what he perceived as the toxic marriage between Paul and Stella, allowing them to finally be together. He profoundly believed that Stella was unhappy in her relationship with Paul and professed that he would do anything to bring her happiness. According to Ron's chilling account, as he was out running errands with Paul and Calvin on the night before Thanksgiving, he cemented the fantasy into a horrifying reality. Ron meticulously laid out the plan. "Calvin, you get the rope? Because you a big guy, and you can hide behind my bedroom door." He then detailed how he would lure Paul downstairs by calling out a fake phone call. Ron's description of the actual murder was profoundly grim. Once Paul was downstairs unsuspecting, Calvin ambushed him, pulling the rope as hard as he could for several minutes. In a desperate and horrific attempt to ensure Paul's death, Ron actually leapt onto Calvin's back, adding his weight to intensify the strangulation. As Paul lay dying, gasping his last breaths, Ron, in a bizarre and macabre gesture, leaned forward, kissed Paul on the forehead, and uttered the chilling words, "Mutton's sorry, but everyone can now be happy." On November 25th, just 3 days after Paul's body was found, the triad of Ron, Calvin, and Stella were all formally arrested and charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy. While all three faced the same grave charges, investigators harbored a strong conviction that Stella was the manipulative architect, the driving force, the very puppet master behind the entire heinous plot. Paul's family, reeling from the betrayal, expressed profound anguish. "The man Stella had murdered, my brother, over insurance money," one family member lamented, reflecting on the profound cruelty. They kanoave kep that Paul, in his boundless generosity, would have willingly given Stella anything she desired. The act was senseless, a betrayal beyond imagining. Mart could imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain, that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money. With the confessions secured and the arrests made, Paul's grieving family placed their trust in the judicial system to deliver justice. However, when it came to Stella's potential fate, they harbored significant concerns. Although Mutt thinks Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it, was a recurring sentiment, underscoring their anxieties about the complexities of proving the depth of her manipulative culpability in court. The investigators, however, were steadfast. They would build the strongest possible case, for they would only get one opportunity at securing justice. In August of 1996, Stella Lacy stood trial for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy. Her alleged co-conspirators, Ronald Faulkner and Calvin Smith, both facing the grave prospect of a potential death penalty, made the pragmatic decision to accept plea deals offered by the prosecution. Their attorneys, shrewdly advising them on their only viable path to self-preservation, counseled them to plead guilty to lesser murder charges rather than gamble on a jury trial that could result in capital punishment. Calvin Smith, in particular, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and received a sentence of 25 years to life in state prison. As part of his plea agreement, Calvin became a key witness for the prosecution, providing crucial testimony against Stella. Ronald Faulkner, motivated by his enduring, albeit twisted, love for Stella, decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder, also receiving a sentence of 25 years to life. Notably, the prosecution did not require him to testify against Stella, recognizing the depth of his infatuation and his likely refusal to harm her in court. Throughout her trial, Stella's demeanor was striking. She remained remarkably cold, utterly stone-faced, exhibiting little discernible emotion. Her defense strategies centered on painting her as an unwitting bystander who did not actively participate in the actual murder. Instead, her legal team argued that she only became aware of Paula's death after the fact, when Ron and Calvin informed her, and her subsequent involvement was limited to reluctantly assisting with the disposal of the body. However, Calvin Smith's testimony directly contradicted this narrative. He testified that Stella was not merely aware, but was, in fact, the individual who explicitly instructed them to make Paul's death appear to be a robbery. Furthermore, he claimed that Stella had expressed a desire for the murder to occur before the Thanksgiving holiday, indicating a clear element of premeditation and strategic planning on her part. Calvin's statements directly challenged Stella's representation that she was entirely insulated from the physical act of the homicide. The prosecution further bolstered their case with the testimony of Paul's estranged cousin, David Womack, who also took the stand. David Womack's startling testimony revealed that Stella had, at an earlier point, directly approached him and offered him $10,000 to kill Paul. This testimony was crucial in demonstrating that Stella had contemplated Paul's murder well in advance, long before Thanksgiving Eve. However, Womack's credibility as a witness was significantly undermined during cross-examination. He had never reported Stella's proposition to the police at the time it occurred, making his belated testimony appear to be motivated by personal animosity or a desire for sour grapes, as it was colloquially described. The jury, swayed by this credibility gap, did not entirely believe his account. Ultimately, the jury rendered its verdict. While they did not find Stella Lacy guilty of the charge of first-degree murder, reflecting the difficulty of proving her direct physical participation, they did convict her on lesser charges: criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution. Stella Lacy was subsequently sentenced to 10 to 32 years in state prison. The verdict evoked a profound sense of disappointment and anger among Paul's family. The first reaction was upset. Anger, one family member stated, articulating the collective frustration. "We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us." Mote feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else because this was all her plan. The investigators, though somewhat disappointed, understood the complexities of the legal process. Mote take that as a loss. "We did our job," one reflected. Mote thinks she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough, Mote think, for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life. Paul's family, however, firmly believed that Paul did not deserve to have his life so cruelly taken away due to someone's greed. He deserved better, they asserted, and they felt he did not receive true justice. They lovingly remembered Paul for his infectious smile, his warming hugs, and his boundless generosity, qualities that, even 3 decades later, continued to resonate within their hearts. They spoke of keeping his memory alive, finding a measure of peace in knowing he was safe, forever cherishing the stand-up man he truly was. Analyzing the myriad motives for such heinous crimes as Paul Lacy's murder reveals a chilling tapestry woven from fundamental human failings and desires. At the forefront often stands financial gain, a powerful motivator. In this case, Stella's awareness of Paul's $50,000 life insurance policies, coupled with the couple's documented money issues and a Chapter 13 bankruptcy filing, clearly fueled the conspiracy. The desire for a sudden windfall to escape the crushing burden of debt can warp moral compasses beyond recognition. For Calvin Smith, the promise of $100 upfront and a cut of the insurance money, even though paltry in hindsight, was enough to entice him into participating in a capital offense, illustrating how even relatively small sums can seem life-changing to those in desperate circumstances. The immediate acquisition of Paul's rings and the money from his pockets, albeit yielding only $40 for Calvin, further solidified the financial dimension of the motive. Another pervasive motive is romantic entanglement and the desperate desire for a new life. Stella's affair with Ron Faulkner and Ron's deeply rooted, obsessive love for Stella created a dangerous dynamic. Ron genuinely believed he was doing everything to make Stella happy, envisioning a future where they could be together, free from what he perceived as Paul's toxic marriage. This illusion of a fresh start, untainted by the perceived difficulties of Paul's presence, provided a powerful, albeit twisted, emotional incentive for Ron to participate. Stella, for her part, did not claim to love Ron, viewing him more as a convenient partner who provided chores, babysitting, a listening ear, and perhaps a reprieve from her marital dissatisfaction. This highlights another common underlying motive: convenience and the evasion of responsibility. Rather than confronting her marital problems directly, seeking separation, or navigating financial distress through legal means, Stella found an easy, albeit catastrophic, path through manipulation. Her admission of disliking and even hating Paul, alongside her fantasies of getting rid of him, reveals a deeply rooted resentment that, when combined with opportunity and influence, metastasized into murder. The role of manipulation, particularly Stella's role as the puppet master, is a frequently observed, insidious force. She exploited Ron's affections and Calvin's greed, meticulously orchestrating a scenario that appeared to absolve her of direct responsibility. Such tragic cases recur with disturbing frequency due to an unfortunate confluence of human weaknesses and environmental pressures. Firstly, the universal frailties of greed, lust, anger, and resentment are potent catalysts. When these emotions fester unchecked within individuals, they can cloud judgment and erode ethical boundaries. The concealment of profound secrets, such as affairs or significant financial distress, creates an environment ripe for desperate measures. Individuals caught in such webs may fear the societal repercussions of honesty or the personal inconvenience of dismantling their current lives, leading them to contemplate more extreme solutions. The underestimation of investigative capabilities and the perceived ease of committing and concealing a crime also play a significant role. Particularly those without a history of violent offenses often overestimate their cleverness and underestimate the dedication and methodical nature of law enforcement. They fail to foresee the numerous cracks in their meticulously planned facades, from overlooked forensic details to the eventual crumbling of an inconsistent story under skilled interrogation. The breakdown of communication and trust within relationships, coupled with the influence of a dominant manipulative personality, as seen in Stella's case, can push individuals towards unthinkable acts. When internal conflicts escalate without healthy resolution, murder tragically becomes a perceived solution. Police investigations into such intimate crimes rely on an array of crucial details and often subtle clues to piece together the truth. In Paul Lacy's case, one of the most important elements was the inconsistencies in the statements of those initially questioned. Stella's evolving narratives about Paul's whereabouts on Thanksgiving Eve, the phantom salami sandwich, and her initial omission of Calvin Smith's presence served as glaring red flags for seasoned detectives. Every deviation, however minor, began to accumulate, forming a pattern of deception. Physical evidence, even seemingly innocuous details, proved paramount. The obvious ligature marks around Paul's neck unequivocally established the cause of death as strangulation and confirmed it as a homicide, immediately ruling out a natural death or a simple disappearance. The absence of other clear wounds, gunshot, knife, redirected the investigative focus. The placement of the body in the car, coupled with the medical examiner's determination, strongly suggested that the actual crime scene was elsewhere and the body had been moved. Most strikingly, Paul's empty stomach, as revealed by the autopsy, directly contradicted Stella's story of his last meal, transforming a casual detail into a critical lie. Another subtle yet impactful clue was the anonymous tip concerning Paul's severe nearsightedness and his constant need for glasses. The discovery of his body without his glasses in the car proved that he could not have driven himself there, shattering any pretense that he simply drove off and perished. Eyewitness observations, even accidental ones, played a pivotal role. The astute patrolman noticing the car parked the wrong way and the neighbor's tip led to the discovery of Paul's body. However, the most compelling eyewitness was arguably Calvin Smith himself, whose chillingly casual remark, "The bottom starts right here," while pointing to the kitchen floor during a police search, was an involuntary yet powerful indicator of the true crime scene. These non-verbal cues and seemingly innocent statements often prove to be the most revealing. Financial records provided a clear motive. The Chapter 13 bankruptcy, filing, and Stella's knowledge of the life insurance policies painted a financial picture entirely different from the stable facade she presented. Even in 1995, rudimentary technological clues, such as the information downloaded from Paul S. pager, helped to corroborate parts of Stella's story. Her attempts to page him, thus temporarily reducing suspicion before her later contradictions became undeniable. Today, such investigations would delve deeply into phone records, digital footprints, social media activity, and financial transactions for even richer veins of evidence. Finally, police rely heavily on an understanding of human psychology and behavior. The knowledge that strangulation often suggests a personal relationship, the shifts in demeanor of suspects when confronted vekeptehat evidence, and the inherent difficulty of maintaining a complex lie under prolonged separate interrogation are all powerful tools in an investigator's arsenal. The clever, though ethically gray, ruse employed against Calvin Smith with the fiber detection instrument exploited psychological vulnerabilities, demonstrating how skilled interrogation techniques can crack seemingly hardened denials. The sophistication of the criminals in Paul Lacy's murder proved to be surprisingly low, ultimately leading to their downfall. Their initial attempts at cover-up were superficial and quickly unraveled by methodical police work. For instance, their efforts to stage a robbery, taking rings and money, turning out pockets, were simplistic and failed to obscure the true nature of the crime, particularly the telltale ligature marks. Their pre-agreed cover story, while designed to provide a unified front, collapsed under the weight of individual interrogations. Each conspirator, when separated, began to introduce subtle deviations and inconsistencies, highlighting the fundamental challenge of maintaining an intricate lie without constant reinforcement. Their planning for body disposal was notably crude. Paul S.'s body was found only a few blocks from his home, indicating a desperate, last-minute decision rather than a sophisticated, long-range plan to conceal the body. Flushing the murder weapon, the rope, down a toilet was another rudimentary attempt at evidence destruction, easily countered by the knowledge that such actions rarely remove all traces and are inherently difficult to accomplish without leaving other telltale signs. The conspirators also exhibited a fundamental failure to account for obvious clues, such as Paul S. glasses, which would immediately contradict the notion that he drove away independently. This oversight alone significantly narrowed the focus of the investigation back to the home. Their relative quickness to confess under pressure, particularly Calvin S. break under the copy machine, Ruse and Ron S. emotional admission, driven by his love for Stella, underscored their lack of experience and mental fortitude for such a severe crime. Moreover, the almost inevitable betrayal among co-conspirators, with Calvin ultimately testifying against Stella, further revealed the inherent instability of their criminal enterprise. While Stella exhibited a degree of manipulative cunning as the puppet master, her elaborate facade was eventually pierced revealing a fundamentally unsophisticated plan built on the manipulation of others rather than truly intelligent criminal execution. The tragic case of Paul Lacy's murder offers several profound life lessons aimed at preventing such heartbreaking occurrences. Paramount among these is the critical importance of open and honest communication within relationships. The Lacy's marriage was fraught with unresolved issues, unreciprocated intimacy, mounting financial burdens, and Stella's deep-seated resentment. Had these issues been addressed constructively, through therapy, honest dialogue, or ultimately, through the difficult but legitimate process of separation, the tragic outcome might have been averted. Hiding affairs and financial distress only serves to create an increasingly volatile environment. Secondly, the case underscores the immutable principle of honesty and integrity. The web of lies woven by Stella, from her initial reports to her shifting narratives and hidden affair, ultimately unraveled disastrously, consuming not only her but also those she manipulated. Lies, especially those intended to deceive or evade responsibility, invariably lead to more profound and often violent consequences. Closely related is the need to beware of manipulation. Recognizing manipulative individuals and escaping toxic relationships is vital for personal safety and well-being. Stella's ability to exploit Ron S. love and Calvin S. greed serves as a stark warning about how easily individuals can become pawns in another S. destructive schemes. The story is a powerful testament to the destructive consequences of greed and envy. The desire for Paul's life insurance money, coupled with a yearning for a life perceived to be free of financial strain, corrupted Stella's judgment entirely. For Calvin, the allure of quick cash, however meager, overshadowed any sense of morality. These material desires, when unchecked, can lead to unimaginably cruel acts. Furthermore, the case highlights the necessity of healthy coping mechanisms. Anger, resentment, and financial pressures are real and can be overwhelming, but resorting to violence is never the solution. Seeking professional help, counseling, or relying on trusted support networks are far more constructive ways to navigate life's challenges. Family vigilance also plays a role. While Paul's family loved him dearly, early recognition of the deep troubles within his marriage, or any concerning behavior from those around him, might have prompted interventions. Finally, the narrative implores us to seek support when in toxic or abusive relationships, recognizing that there are resources available to help navigate these difficult waters safely and constructively, preventing escalations that can lead to tragedy. In striving for a more effective and rapid response to such heinous crimes, law enforcement agencies can implement and enhance several strategies. Firstly, a thorough initial investigation is paramount. Collecting every single detail, no matter how seemingly minor, from the outset ensures that no crucial piece of the puzzle is overlooked. This meticulous approach includes immediate and expansive questioning of all present, noting nonverbal cues and potential inconsistencies from the very beginning. Secondly, there should be an immediate safeguarding of potential crime scenes. In cases like Paul Lacy's, where the body is found elsewhere, it's critical to treat the victim's last known location, in this instance, the home, as a potential crime scene from the earliest stages. While obtaining a search warrant takes time, proactive measures like seeking consent searches, as done in this case, can accelerate access to vital evidence before it can be tampered with. A strong emphasis on flagging and re-examining contradictory statements immediately is crucial. Detectives should be trained to meticulously document every nuance of a suspect's story and cross-reference them diligently. Every inconsistency, however slight, can become a significant crack in a fabricated narrative. Utilizing all available forensic tools, even those considered basic at the time, is indispensable. In today's context, this means leveraging advanced DNA analysis, digital forensics mining phone data, social media, geolocation, financial transactions, fiber analysis, and trace evidence collection to their fullest potential. Even in 1995, more could have been extracted from the actual crime scene had it been identified and sealed earlier. Applying criminal profiling to understand the nature of the crime is also beneficial. Recognizing that strangulation often points to a personal, intimate relationship, rather than a random act of violence, helps direct investigative resources efficiently towards the inner circle of the victim. This understanding guides initial suspect identification. Furthermore, continuous training in advanced psychological interviewing techniques equips detectives with the skills to break down false narratives and elicit confessions from individuals who initially resist. The successful ruse used against Calvin Smith, although a dated technique, highlights the effectiveness of skilled interrogators in navigating the psychological landscape of suspects. Interdepartmental cooperation is another cornerstone of efficient investigations. Seamless sharing of information and resources between local police, state police, and forensic teams prevents siloing of critical data and ensures a comprehensive approach. Crucially, public engagement through anonymous tip lines, community outreach programs, and maintaining public trust can lead to valuable unsolicited information, as demonstrated by the tip about Paul's glasses. Finally, law enforcement agencies must commit to continuous training for their personnel, ensuring detectives and officers are updated on the latest investigative methodologies, cutting-edge forensic science, and evolving criminal psychology. This ensures they remain one step ahead of perpetrators, no matter how amateur or seemingly cunning their plots may be. The Lacy case, for all its tragedy, stands as a testament to the persistent dedication of investigators, demonstrating that truth, even when obscured by deceit and betrayal, eventually finds its light. The human spirit, in its resilience and pursuit of justice, invariably triumphs over the insidious shadows of criminality, ensuring that while pain lingers, the quest for accountability brings a profound and enduring peace. In the quiet, snow-dusted city of Schenectady, New York, where the chill of late autumn was just beginning to give way to the more biting cold of winter, a horrifying discovery was about to shatter the peace of a Thanksgiving weekend in the year 1995. The community, like many across the nation, had just observed a day of gratitude and family togetherness, a time typically associated with warmth, fellowship, and hearty meals shared around a festive table. Yet, for one family, this holiday season would forever be stained by an unimaginable tragedy, a dark act born from a web of deceit, desperation, and a chilling disregard for human life. This case, unfolding with a macabre irony against the backdrop of gratitude, offers a profound and cautionary tale about the insidious nature of greed and betrayal, examining how seemingly ordinary individuals can become entangled in extraordinary darkness. The story began subtly with the low hum of domestic life that often masks deeper currents of discord. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 1995. While most were gathered with loved ones, 30-year-old Stella Lacy found herself making a different kind of call. A call to the Schenectady Police Department, reporting her husband, Paul Lacy, missing. Her account to the responding officers painted a picture of a typical night, albeit with a slight deviation from their usual routine. She recounted seeing Paul the previous evening, Thanksgiving Eve. She had retired to bed around 11:30. Paul, she explained, had remained downstairs, rummaging through the kitchen for a late-night snack, a behavior, she assured, the police was not entirely unusual for him. It was also not uncommon, she noted, for Paul to occasionally sleep on a couch or a daybed on the first floor, or even to venture out late. However, his failure to return to bed that night, and crucially, his absence throughout Thanksgiving Day, was, in her words, highly out of character, and indeed, unusual. Paul's family corroborated this sentiment, expressing deep concern. To them, the idea of Uncle Paul missing Thanksgiving dinner was practically an impossibility. His life, they stressed, revolved around his family, his presence at such gatherings a foundational certainty. His niece reflected on this, stating unequivocally that Paul would always come home, and that this absence was profoundly abnormal. The Schenectady Police Department, upon receiving Stella S. report, dispatched an officer to the Lacy residence to conduct an initial interview. The officer, diligently pursuing the standard protocol for a missing persons case, asked Stella to chronologically detail the events leading up to Paul's mysterious disappearance. She informed the patrolman that Paul had been at work throughout the day on Thanksgiving Eve. Interestingly, Ron Faulkner, Paul's first cousin, was also residing in the home at the time, renting a room from the Lacys. Stella mentioned that when Paul arrived home from work, she had dispatched both Ron and Paul on an errand to procure some bread for the Thanksgiving stuffing, along with a few other sundry items, while she continued her preparations for the holiday feast. According to Stella's narrative, Paul and Ron had returned from their grocery run sometime around 11 o'clock that evening. A neighbor, Calvin Smith, who lived directly across the street, a residence situated kitty-corner to the Lacey's home, reportedly stopped by just to socialize with Ron and Paul. Shortly thereafter, Stella stated, she went upstairs to bed. She reiterated that Paul did not join her that night. The following morning, on Thanksgiving Day itself, she initially believed he might have simply left for work. She attempted to page him, a common communication method of the era, but received no response. It was this lack of response, coupled with his continued absence, that prompted her to file the missing persons report. Despite the relatively short duration, less than 24 hours since his last confirmed sighting, missing persons are immediately entered into a national database. In this particular instance, a vehicle was also involved in the disappearance. A 1986 Volvo bearing a New York license plate. All pertinent details, including the vehicle description, were thoroughly logged into the national system. During the interview, the patrol officer requested a recent photograph of Paul and inquired about any extenuating circumstances Stella felt the police should be aware of. Stella stated that Paul was not a user of illegal substances, but acknowledged that he had been under significant pressure. They were experiencing considerable financial difficulties. Paul had, in fact, recently lost a job, though he had subsequently secured new employment at a local Coca-Cola warehouse. Despite this, their debts were substantial. She further revealed that Paul had recently cashed out his $401,000 retirement fund, an amount totaling approximately $8,000. Nevertheless, she stressed, Paul would never abandon his family and children, especially not on a holiday. Following these initial interviews, Vekep Tehat Stella and some neighbors, detectives reported that they had not yet developed any promising leads. Paul's known unwavering devotion to his family made his disappearance all the more inexplicable and unsettling. 2 days later, as the investigation labored in uncertainty, a pivotal tip finally arrived. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, the Schenectady Police Department received a call from a person living DUET 2.5 blocks away from the Lacy residence. The caller reported observing a car parked on a one-way street, conspicuously parked in the wrong direction, directly in front of their house. Inside the vehicle, a man appeared to be sleeping. Responding officers made repeated attempts to rouse the individual, pounding on the car windows and knocking vigorously on the side panels. Sensing the gravity of the situation, they determined it necessary to summon emergency medical services. Upon opening the door, they quickly realized that the man was not merely asleep. He was obviously deceased and disturbingly nearly frozen solid. A cursory search of the body revealed no wallet, but officers did manage to locate an identification card in one of his pockets. With this crucial piece of information, the police immediately identified the deceased as Paul Lacy. The investigation, which had begun as a missing person case, had now unequivocally transformed into a homicide inquiry. Paul Lacy's life, before its abrupt and brutal end, was one marked by a loving spirit and deep familial connections. Born on May 12, 1964, in Albany, New York, he grew up with a younger sister as part of a sprawling extended family. His sister recalled him as a loving brother, reminiscing about shared moments, watching cartoons, and his protective care, noting how he would always take her to school, guiding her little steps. They were raised by strong mothers, which, his sister believed, instilled in them a sense of decency. Paul was remembered as a happy child, someone who savored life, pursuing whatever brought him joy. His father was largely absent from his life, a void that likely shaped Paul's own fervent commitment to fatherhood. His mother, despite relying on the welfare system, was resolute in her determination to provide for her children. After completing high school in the early 1980s, Paul embarked on his career, initially working at a local market. His diligence and capability quickly saw him rise through the ranks to a managerial position. It was also at this workplace that he encountered his future wife, Stella Lacy. Stella, along with her family, lived in Paul S. neighborhood. Her father was described as a hard-working man. Her mother a stay-at-home parent, suggesting Stella hailed from a stable home environment. Friends and family noted that Stella had dated other individuals who were not as kind-hearted as Paul. Paul, in contrast, was perceived as a nurturing and caring individual, yearning for someone to cherish. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Stella began spending more time vekep into him, and before long, in 1986, the young couple married. In the years following their marriage, Paul and Stella diligently built a life together. They were blessed with 3 beautiful children, a daughter, followed by a son, and then another daughter, born 16 months prior to the tragic events. Paul's career path led him to Cargill, a flour mill located at the Port of Albany, a place known for its well-paying jobs. He became the quintessential provider, working tirelessly to fulfill Stella's desires. This began with a car, then progressed to purchasing a house, even installing a swimming pool. He dedicated himself entirely to providing everything for his family, driven, perhaps, by his own yearning for a father figure, determined to be that unwavering presence for his own children. He strived to be the best father possible to his 9-year-old, 7-year-old, and 16-month-old children. His heart was truly kind, his efforts always directed toward doing his utmost for whomever he encountered, regardless of their background. Paul's aspirations were defined by milestones, steadily building towards retirement and his children's education. His goals continuously ascended, reflecting his commitment to their future. However, these dreams were abruptly extinguished just 2 days after Thanksgiving Day, 1995, when Paul was found deceased. Upon initial inspection of the scene, the precise manner of his death remained unclear. The car keys were found on the floor of the front seat. There was no shattered glass, nor any signs of a struggle such as disheveled clothing. Crucially, there was no blood, no evidence of gunshots, and no visible knife wounds. Despite the absence of overt injuries, a more thorough inspection of Paul's body revealed a telling sign of foul play. He bore at least 2 distinct ligature marks encircling his neck, confirming beyond doubt that he had been strangled. The limited space in the back seat of the Volvo, where Paul's body was discovered, immediately raised questions for investigators. It would have been exceedingly difficult, they reasoned, for someone to strangle him effectively from that position. This suggested the perpetrator would need considerable size and strength to execute such an act within the confines of the vehicle, or, more likely, that the strangulation did not occur in the car at all. The investigative conclusion leaned heavily towards the latter. Paul S.'s murder, they deduced, had been committed elsewhere, and his body subsequently moved to the car. This insight was critical, steering the investigation away from the immediate scene of discovery as the primary crime location. The nature of the death itself, strangulation, was also a significant detail. Unlike, for example, a gunshot wound or a stab wound that might suggest a robbery gone awry, strangulation is often a deeply personal act. Law enforcement experience indicates that individuals who resort to strangling another person typically share a personal relationship with their victim, pointing towards someone close to Paul as a potential perpetrator. As the investigation intensified, detectives would soon learn about a recent conflict involving Paul and discover that their attention was shifting towards individuals they had previously considered beyond suspicion. In the aftermath of identifying Paul Lacy, investigators faced the grim task of understanding not just how he died, but why and who was responsible. The scene where Paul's body was found yielded puzzling details. His pockets, in his black jeans, were turned inside out, and he was missing 3 rings he was known to always wear. These details suggested a possible robbery or a robbery murder, a theory Stella initially lent credence to by claiming Paul always carried a substantial amount of money. The only item recovered from his person was a pager on his belt. The information from the pager was downloaded, and it corroborated Stella S.'s story that she had tried paging him, and he responded. This initial piece of evidence, seemingly innocuous, at first appeared to support Stella S.'s version of events. After forensic specialists from the state police concluded their on-scene work, Paul S.'s body was transferred for an autopsy, a procedure crucial for understanding the exact cause and manner of death. Following these grim tasks, investigators notified Stella, asking her to come to the police department for a formal death notification. She responded with profound sadness, appearing visibly distraught and crying. Once she had composed herself somewhat, detectives explained that they needed her help to uncover the truth of what had happened to Paul. Acknowledging her traumatized state, especially with 3 young children now, without their father, the investigators adopted a cautious approach. They understood that in such emotionally charged circumstances, a person might unintentionally misstate or omit details. While they noted some inconsistencies between her statements in this second interview and her initial report to the patrolman, they chose not to press her aggressively, attributing these discrepancies to emotional distress or forgetfulness. For instance, in this interview, she claimed she saw Paul eat a salami sandwich at 11:30 Funmame on Thanksgiving Eve, a detail conspicuously absent from her first account. She also added that Paul had come up to bed that night and attempted to initiate intimacy, which she had refused. Despite these new details, the police held back from painting her into a corner, waiting for more concrete evidence to emerge. Interestingly, during this second interview, Stella notably omitted any mention of their neighbor, Calvin Smith, who she had initially stated was socializing with Paul and Ron that evening. However, she offered another potential theory regarding Paul's enemies, an ongoing feud with his first cousin, David Womack, who had recently lived with them for a few months. Paul, being the compassionate soul he was, had offered David a place to stay when other family members had turned him away. But according to Stella, the arrangement quickly soured. David was prone to rage-type arguments and was known to carry firearms, a stark contrast to Paul's non-physical nature. Paul, who wasn't a fighter, had finally put his foot down, insisting David leave the house. This ultimatum, Stella claimed, ignited a furious response from David. According to Stella, David Womack retaliated by slashing the tires on Paul's cars. Although David was never formally charged for this incident, it marked a definitive breaking point in their relationship. Investigators quickly tracked down David Womack for an interview. Predictably, he vehemently denied any involvement in Paul's disappearance or death, stating he hadn't seen Paul in a considerable time, certainly not on Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving Day. David claimed he had gone hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day, an alibi that was subsequently corroborated by friends and family. Despite the initial suspicion surrounding David due to his known anger issues and the history with Paul, his solid alibi effectively ruled him out as a viable suspect. With David Womack no longer a lead, detectives placed their hopes on Paul's autopsy report to provide a fresh direction. The medical examiner's findings were clear. Paul's death was unequivocally a homicide caused by ligature strangulation. The distinctive bruising and pattern of the ligature marks around his neck offered irrefutable proof. However, pinpointing an exact time of death proved challenging. The fact that Paul's body was nearly frozen due to the cold weather made precise estimations down to specific days difficult. Consequently, investigators had to rely on indirect indicators, such as stomach contents, combined with Stella's statement that Paul had eaten a salami sandwich at 11:30 Funmame on Thanksgiving Eve. But a crucial contradiction emerged. Paul's stomach was completely empty. This finding starkly contradicted Stella's account, suggesting he had not eaten for a considerable time before his death. The last person to see him alive had claimed he ate a meal. Yet the autopsy proved otherwise. This inconsistency immediately raised significant skepticism among investigators about Stella's initial reports. They now faced more unanswered questions than before, and the possibility of Stella's involvement, once a peripheral thought, began to solidify. The pressure mounted to uncover physical evidence, credible witness testimony, or definitive proof of where the murder had occurred, given that Paul's body had been moved from the actual crime scene. The glaring contradiction between Stella's statement and the autopsy report significantly amplified police suspicions regarding the veracity of her entire narrative. If Paul hadn't eaten a salami sandwich on Thanksgiving Eve, as she claimed, then her entire timeline, including her last sighting of him, became questionable. The burning question for detectives was the true location of the murder. Logic dictated that if he was last seen at his home, the house itself was the most probable primary crime scene. However, securing a search warrant for a residence is a rigorous legal process, requiring substantial probable cause and taking valuable time. To expedite the investigation, officers opted for a less intrusive but equally effective approach. They requested consent to search the home from Stella and Ron Faulkner, Paul's cousin, who also resided there. Both Stella and Ron readily consented, allowing investigators to thoroughly sweep the house. Detectives scoured every corner, meticulously searching upstairs bedrooms, bathrooms, closets, drawers, and other private areas, looking for any sign, however faint, of a struggle or evidence connected to Paul's death. It was during this meticulous search that a peculiar incident occurred. While one of the investigators was inside the house, a man casually walked through the back door and directly into the kitchen, without so much as a knock. The investigator, momentarily surprised, exchanged a polite nod and greeting with the man, who immediately proceeded to the Thanksgiving turkey, tore off a leg, and began to eat it. When asked his identity, the man identified himself as Calvin Smith, a neighbor. This name immediately resonated with the detective. Calvin Smith was the neighbor Stella had initially mentioned was socializing with Paul and Ron on Thanksgiving Eve, but had notably omitted in her second interview. The detective, observing Calvin's calm and collected demeanor as he savored the turkey leg, amidst a house swarming with homicide detectives, felt an instant prickle of intuition. Calvin casually remarked on the sadness of Paul's death. The detective responded, "Yes, but we Leglung get to the bottom of this," to which Calvin, still unperturbed, pointed his hand towards the kitchen floor and cryptically declared, "The bottom starts right here." This statement, delivered with unnerving composure, immediately seized the detective's attention. He probed further, asking what Calvin meant, but Calvin merely shrugged his shoulders, offering no further explanation. The detective, sensing a deeper significance to the neighbor's words and an almost chilling calmness, made a mental note. This unexpected encounter strongly reinforced the growing suspicion that the house itself was central to the crime. Despite the palpable unease, the detective, adhering to protocol, chose not to pressure Calvin at that moment, unsure of his exact involvement, but recognizing the necessity of sharing this crucial observation with the rest of the investigative team. Further bolstering their suspicions was an anonymous phone call received by the police department. The caller, whose identity was never definitively established, imparted a vital piece of information. Paul Lacy suffered from extremely poor eyesight and needed to wear his glasses constantly. This seemingly minor detail quickly became a major clue. Investigators immediately checked the Volvo where Paul's body was found, and indeed, his glasses were nowhere to be found. The absence of his glasses conclusively indicated that Paul had not driven the car to the location where it was discovered. This realization decisively redirected the focus of the investigation back to the last place Paul was confirmed to be alive and wearing his glasses: his own home, with his wife Stella, his cousin Ron Faulkner, and now, suspiciously, Calvin Smith, with a stronger, albeit circumstantial, case pointing towards the house as the primary crime scene, and towards the three individuals last seen with Paul. Investigators formulated a new strategy. They decided it was time to conduct a third round of interviews, this time bringing Stella, Ron, and Calvin individually to the police department. They were not yet under arrest, but the objective was clear: interview them separately. A classic interrogation technique designed to unravel inconsistencies or corroborate their stories. The theory was that maintaining a consistent lie under independent questioning becomes exceedingly difficult, as one lie leads to another. Any seemingly minor discrepancies from earlier statements would now come into sharp focus, potentially adding up to a mountain of doubt. The detectives Noove Kep operated under a strong conviction that at least one, if not all, of them were involved, and that the murder had indeed taken place within the confines of the Lacy home. The detailed interviews commenced, with Stella Lacy being questioned first. From the outset, detectives noticed a distinct shift in her demeanor. She was visibly nervous, her usual composure replaced by an unsettled apprehension, clearly aware that Ron and Calvin were being interviewed in adjacent rooms. This time, unlike her earlier reticence, Stella began to peel back the layers of the picture-perfect marriage she had initially presented. She admitted that her marriage to Paul was not, in fact, as idyllic as she had painted. They were experiencing significant problems, including a pronounced difference in their desires for intimacy, with Paul constantly seeking it, and Stella often unwilling to participate. Financial pressures, too, were a major source of contention. Paul was a free spender, she explained, leading them to file for Chapter 13 bankruptcy protection to safeguard their house and vehicles. Despite this financial strain, Paul continued to spend money, leaving Stella feeling as though she was perpetually struggling to keep them afloat. In her candid revelations, Stella spoke of Ron Faulkner, Paul's cousin, who lived in their home. Ron, she described, was a breath of fresh air. He was attentive, a stark contrast to Paul, and listened to her, which Paul seemingly did not. Ron had taken on many household chores and endeared himself to the children as Uncle Ron. The biggest bombshell, however, was yet to drop. Stella confessed that she had been having an affair with Ron for approximately 1 year, and, with a chilling twist of fate, Thanksgiving Day had actually marked their anniversary. When pressed about her feelings for Ron, Stella admitted she did not love him. Rather, he was a convenience, someone who helped with babysitting, cleaning, and various chores around the house. As for potential motives, 2 key factors emerged. Beyond the affair with Paul's cousin, who had lived in their home for 6 or 7 months, Stella also revealed the existence of 2 life insurance policies on Paul, totaling a sum of $50,000. With the financial pressures and the illicit affair now brought to light, Stella further confessed to harboring strong negative feelings toward Paul, admitting she disliked and even hated him. She openly spoke about discussing getting rid of Paulve, Kep ite hot Ron, though she initially claimed she never believed these discussions were taken seriously. However, her detailed account of Thanksgiving Eve painted a far darker picture. Stella recounted that she had gone up to bed, and a short time later, Paul joined her, desiring intimacy. She rejected his advances, and they settled in for the night. Approximately 15 minutes later, she claimed, Ron yelled upstairs, informing Paul that he had a phone call and suggesting he come downstairs to take it. Paul left the bedroom. A few minutes later, Ron came upstairs and asked Stella to come down. Descending the stairs, Stella walked into Ron's bedroom and was confronted with a horrifying sight. Paul lying face down, a pink blanket draped over his head. Beside Ron, she observed Calvin Smith, the neighbor who had stopped by earlier. She confessed to standing there for a few minutes, staring at the inert form of her husband, the grim reality slowly dawning on her. Paul was dead. Panic, she claimed, then set in. The 3 of them, Stella, Ron, and Calvin, allegedly agreed, "We gotta get rid of him." Stella then went back upstairs to retrieve Paul's shoes, pants, shirt, belt, and pager. She, Ron, and Calvin then undertook the macabre task of dressing Paul's dead body, a difficult endeavor as it is not easy to dress a deceased person. Afterward, Calvin and Ron loaded Paul S.'s body into the back seat of his Volvo. Stella remained at the house, tasked with cleaning up any evidence. She also stated that Calvin, the neighbor, had taken the rope used to strangle Paul and had disposed of it by flushing it down the toilet. Once Paul's body was secured in the car, Ron drove the vehicle a mere couple of blocks away. The three conspirators, according to Stella's confession, then formalized their plan. They would ensure their stories aligned with the primary objective, being to make Paul's death appear as a robbery gone wrong. To achieve this, Paul S.'s 3 rings were removed, and the money was taken from his pockets. Stella would then wait until the following day, Friday, to report Paul missing. As part of the deception, she planned to page him multiple times throughout that Friday, creating a fa-ade of genuine concern, so that the police would believe she was truly worried. While Stella's confession seemingly provided answers to many outstanding questions, detectives, ever analytical, sensed a subtle downplaying of her own central involvement. Her narrative felt a little too convenient, almost as if she were distancing herself from the most heinous aspects of the crime. The investigator mused, "Mot donnit know. How true her confession is or not. Motive got enough to believe that she is telling the truth to a point. But we need to talk to Ron and Calvin and put their stories together and see how close they are matching. The true depth of the betrayal and the specific grisly details of Paul S.'s last moments were yet to fully emerge, waiting to be revealed in the subsequent interviews. With Stella's intricate confession now on record, though tinged vacep, ite hot suspicion about her precise level of orchestration, detectives turned their attention to Calvin Smith and Ron Faulkner. Their separate interrogations would be crucial for corroborating Stella's story and, more importantly, unmasking the full truth, particularly regarding Stella's manipulative role. The goal was to dismantle any remaining lies and reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. The interrogation of Calvin Smith proved challenging initially. Calvin vehemently denied any involvement in Paul S.'s murder. The detectives knew, however, that Calvin S.'s hands had to have come into contact with the rope if Stella S.'s story about him disposing of it was true. One seasoned investigator, sensing Calvin's hesitation, decided to employ a clever psychological ruse, leveraging the technical limitations and public perception of forensic science in the year 1995. He began by asking Calvin if he knew what rope was made of. Calvin cautiously responded with a vague affirmative. The detective then explained, with an air of absolute certainty, that rope was made of fibers, and if one were to touch that rope, those fibers would undoubtedly embed themselves in one's hands. He then delivered the fabrication. The Schenectady Police Department had just acquired a state-of-the-art fiber detection instrument, a brand new, cutting-edge piece of equipment, a claim carefully constructed around the reality that photocopiers, at the time, were still seen as impressive, modern technology. The detective led Calvin out of the interview room, directing him towards a new, large photocopier the department had recently purchased. Presenting it as the Advanced Fiber Detection Instrument, he lifted its cover, indicating where Calvin should place his hand for the detection process. As Calvin placed his hand on the glass, the bright light of the photocopier flashed. The detective sternly instructed him not to look directly at the light. Startled by the flash, Calvin instinctively pulled his hand away. It was at that precise moment, right there at the photocopier, that the ruse broke Calvin's resistance. With a defeated sigh, Calvin confessed, "All right, Mot did it. Mot strangled Paul. Mot put the rope around his neck twice." The detective later reflected on the moment, acknowledging the use of a deceptive tactic but justifying it as permissible under the law. He stated he felt bad for having tricked Calvin, but emphasized that it did not interfere with Calvin's right to due process, nor did it coerce an innocent person into a false confession. Calvin's confession provided stark, harrowing details. According to him, Stella was far from an innocent bystander. He explicitly stated that he went along with the murder because Stella had promised him $100 up front, along with a significant cut from the insurance payout on Paul's life. He had been desperate, viewing this as potentially life-changing money. As part of the fake robbery, they had removed Paul's 3 rings, but instead of the lucrative sum he envisioned, Calvin received a paltry $40 for them. The betrayal and the paltry sum, no doubt, weighed on him. Following Calvin's confession, Ron Faulkner was next. Ron's motive, as it turned out, was entirely different from Calvin's financially driven desperation. Ron confessed to being deeply, unequivocally in love with Stella. He desired nothing more than to end what he perceived as Stella's toxic relationship and marriage with Paul, so that they could be together. Ron was convinced that Stella's unhappiness stemmed from her relationship with Paul, and he was prepared to do anything to make her happy. The fateful decision to act on these dark fantasies was made on Thanksgiving Eve, while Ron was out running errands with Paul and Calvin. Ron recounted the chilling details of the plot. He orchestrated the crime with meticulous precision. He instructed Calvin, who was a physically imposing man, to secure a rope and hide behind his bedroom door. Ron then carried out his role, yelling up the stairs to Paul, beckoning him downstairs for a fictitious phone call. As Paul descended and entered Ron's bedroom, Calvin emerged from behind the door, rope in hand. Ron described how Calvin pulled as hard as he could for a couple minutes, applying the ligature around Paul's neck. In a horrifying escalation of the violence, Ron himself joined in, leaping onto Calvin's back to add more weight and leverage to the strangulation, ensuring Paul's death. In a final, morbid gesture as Paul drew his last breaths, Ron leaned forward, kissed Paul on the forehead, and chillingly whispered, "Mo't sorry, but everyone can now be happy." This act revealed a deeply disturbing emotional entanglement and a twisted sense of justification for his brutal actions. With the confessions of both Calvin and Ron, the full picture of the conspiracy came into focus. The stories, while differing in nuanced details, corroborated the essential sequence of events, and most damningly, Stella's central role as the orchestrator. 3 days after Paul Lacy was found, on November 25th, Ron Faulkner, Calvin Smith, and Stella Lacy were also arrested. They faced severe charges: murder, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy. Though all 3 were implicated, investigators firmly believed Stella was the mastermind, the puppet master, pulling the strings of a tragically predictable crime, driven by selfishness and financial gain. The profound impact of Paul's senseless murder resonated deeply with his family. His sister articulated their collective shock and despair, expressing an inability to comprehend such an act of betrayal. She emphasized that Paul, in his unbounded generosity, would have willingly given Stella anything she desired. The idea that she would orchestrate his death over insurance money struck them as utterly senseless, a betrayal of the deepest kind. Couldn't imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money. His sister lamented, articulating the profound sorrow and incomprehension felt by those who loved Paul. This tragic act, driven by Stella's calculated greed and cold manipulation, was an unforgivable affront to his kind and giving nature. As the legal proceedings commenced, Paul's family grappled with a different kind of concern. The quest for true justice, particularly concerning Stella. They harbored significant doubts about whether Stella would receive a punishment commensurate with her perceived culpability, believing she was the primary architect of the crime. A prosecuting attorney acknowledged the challenge. Although Mort think Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it. The legal system requires clear, unambiguous evidence, and the nuances of psychological manipulation versus direct physical involvement can prove difficult for a jury to navigate. Prosecutors knew they had one shot and needed to build the strongest possible case, leveraging all available evidence and testimony. In August 1996, the trial of Stella Lacy for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy, began. In a critical pre-trial development, both Ronald Faulkner and Calvin Smith, facing potential death penalty charges, opted to take plea deals. Their attorneys likely advised them that their best, perhaps only, chance to spare their own lives was to plead guilty to lesser murder charges. Calvin Smith pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in state prison. Ronald Faulkner pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, also receiving a sentence of 25 years to life. As part of his plea agreement, Calvin Smith was compelled to provide testimony against Stella Lacy during her trial. Significantly, Ron Faulkner was not required to testify, a decision often attributed to his enduring, though misguided, love for Stella, indicating he would never willingly harm her by testifying against her. Throughout her trial, Stella's demeanor remained strikingly cold, often described as stone-faced and devoid of apparent emotion. The defense strategy revolved around presenting Stella as a secondary, unwitting participant in the immediate act of murder. They argued that she did not physically participate in Paul's death, but only became aware of it after the fact, when Ron and Calvin informed her of what had transpired. Her subsequent involvement, the defense contended, was limited to helping dispose of the body, essentially portraying her as an accessory after the fact, rather than a primary instigator. However, Calvin Smith's testimony directly contradicted this narrative. Under oath, Calvin testified that Stella was, in fact, the one who explicitly told him Paul's death needed to be made to look like a robbery. He also claimed that Stella had expressed a desire for the murder to occur before the Thanksgiving holiday, suggesting a degree of pre-planning and cold calculation. Calvin's testimony directly challenged the defense portrayal of Stella as merely insulated from the actual homicide, indicating her active, guiding role. Adding another layer of complexity and potential premeditation, Paul's estranged cousin David Womack also took the stand as a witness. David testified that Stella had previously approached him and offered him $10,000 to kill Paul. Womack's statement, if believed, would have irrefutably demonstrated Stella's long-standing intention and careful planning regarding Paul's murder. Despite the compelling nature of these testimonies, Womack's credibility was severely questioned by the jury. The fact that he had never reported Stella's alleged offer to the police at the time the incident occurred severely undermined his account, leading it to appear as sour grapes or a fabricated claim born of past resentment. Ultimately, the jury did not believe his testimony. The verdict in Stella Lacy's trial reflected the nuanced challenges of proving intent and direct participation. She was found not guilty of first-degree murder. However, the jury did find her guilty of criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution. She was sentenced to 10 to 32 years in state prison. For Paul's family, the verdict, while bringing some resolution, also brought a profound sense of disappointment and anger. The first reaction was upset, anger. His sister stated, "We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us." Mote feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else, because this was all her plan. The detective, though professionally bound by the verdict, also shared a sense of the outcome's inherent flaws. Conceding, of course, Mott was disappointed. Mott take that as a loss. We did our job. Mott thinks she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough. Mott think for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life. The family mourned not only the loss of Paul, but also what they perceived as an incomplete justice, feeling that the manipulative orchestrator had not faced the full consequences of her actions. Paul did not deserve to have his life taken away because of somebody's greed. He deserved better, and he didn't get that, his sister concluded. The case of Paul Lacy offers numerous profound life lessons and insights into human behavior and the workings of justice. At its core, the primary motive for this tragic crime was an insidious blend of greed and a desperate desire to appease marital discontent, coupled with a misguided belief in romantic happiness facilitated by murder. Stella Lacy, dissatisfied with her marriage and burdened by financial problems, saw an opportunity for escape and monetary gain through Paul's life insurance policies. Her affair with Ron Faulkner provided an emotional outlet and a willing accomplice driven by a twisted form of love. These motives, financial desperation, the pursuit of an illicit romance, and the perception of a spouse as an obstacle, are, sadly, common drivers in similar crimes, indicating the ever-present danger when individuals prioritize self-interest over the sanctity of life and legal boundaries. Such cases frequently arise from prolonged periods of unhappiness or dissatisfaction within relationships, where communication breaks down, and individuals seek drastic, irreversible solutions rather than pursuing separation, counseling, or other ethical avenues. The sophistication of the criminals in this case, however, proved to be remarkably low, particularly in their planning and execution. While they attempted to orchestrate the murder to appear as a robbery, their efforts were riddled with amateurish oversights and easily detectable lies. The concept of making the murder look like a robbery by turning out pockets and taking rings was a simplistic cover-up. The most glaring error was Stella's fabrication about Paul eating a salami sandwich just before his disappearance. This easily verifiable detail, debunked by a routine autopsy, immediately cast a dark shadow of doubt on her entire narrative. Moreover, the decision to dump the body only a few blocks from the house, on a street where the car was parked improperly, was both careless and indicative of a lack of foresight. The murderers also overlooked the simple fact of Paul's profound nearsightedness and his dependence on glasses. Their absence in the car immediately signaled that he could not have driven himself to that location, definitively placing the scene of the crime elsewhere, likely at home. These glaring errors suggest a criminal mindset driven more by impulse and a naive belief in their own cleverness than by meticulous, sophisticated planning. Police relied on several critical details and clues to track down the perpetrators, demonstrating the triumph of systematic investigation over superficial deception. The journey to justice began with Stella's inconsistent statements, which, though initially given the benefit of the doubt, gradually accumulated into a pattern of suspicion. The empty stomach revelation from the autopsy was the first irrefutable scientific contradiction to her story, turning mild skepticism into serious doubt. The discovery of Paul's body close to his home in a haphazard manner pointed away from a random act of violence. The anonymous tip about Paul S. glasses provided the crucial missing piece, confirming he didn't drive his car and implicating the last known location, the home, as the likely murder scene. The meticulous search of the house, even when consent was given, laid the groundwork for further evidence. However, it was the keen observation and quick thinking of the detective encountering Calvin Smith, and Calvin S.'s bizarrely calm statement about the bottom starts right here while eating turkey amidst a homicide investigation that truly pinpointed an insider. The decision to interview Stella, Ron, and Calvin separately was a textbook, yet incredibly effective, police tactic. It is inherently difficult for multiple people to maintain a consistent lie under independent, prolonged questioning. This strategy successfully cracked the facade, leading to sequential confessions that filled in the horrific details and confirmed the conspiracy. Furthermore, the detective's shrewd psychological ruse with the photocopier, posing it as a fiber detection instrument, showcased how understanding human psychology and fear of technology, even misplaced fear, can be instrumental in securing a confession when direct evidence is elusive at an early stage. From this tragic case, profound life lessons emerge for preventing such devastating events. Firstly, the paramount importance of healthy communication in relationships and seeking external, professional help when faced with marital distress cannot be overstated. Paul and Stella's marriage, riddled with financial strain and a lack of intimacy, deteriorated into a breeding ground for resentment and illicit affairs. Had they addressed their problems openly, sought counseling, or chosen a lawful separation, Paul's life could have been saved. Secondly, this case highlights the insidious nature of unresolved anger and grievance. David Womack's past altercation with Paul, though ultimately unrelated to the murder itself due to his ironclad alibi, underscores how quickly unresolved personal conflicts can spiral, often fueling baseless suspicions. Swift, mediated conflict resolution, even in family disputes, is vital. For law enforcement, several insights on catching perpetrators faster can be drawn. The value of detailed initial interviews, even when allowing for emotional inconsistencies, is evident. Recording these early statements meticulously helps identify later contradictions. Trusting gut feelings or intuition, as the detective did with Calvin Smith, is important, but only when carefully integrated into structured investigative work. Crucially, employing psychological tactics within legal and ethical bounds can be incredibly effective when suspects are resistant. However, perhaps the most critical takeaway for faster apprehension is the necessity of comprehensive forensic analysis and leveraging seemingly minor details. The empty stomach, the missing glasses, and the simple proximity of the body to the home were all small clues that, when meticulously pieced together, provided an unassailable path to the truth. These details, initially subtle, ultimately became the undoing of the murderer's poorly constructed deception. Modern forensic capabilities, significantly more advanced than in 1995, further empower investigators to unearth such seemingly minute clues. The story of Paul Lacy's final days, as retold and analyzed, is a poignant narrative that underscores the fragility of life and the catastrophic consequences of succumbing to the darkest impulses of human nature. It serves as a somber reminder that betrayal, born of greed and selfishness, can wear the disguise of intimacy, and that justice, though sometimes agonizingly slow and imperfect, often prevails through diligent, insightful investigation. Paul Lacy, remembered for his infectious smile, his warmth, his unlimited generosity, lives on in the hearts of his loved ones, a testament to a good life, cut tragically short by actions driven by avarice and a twisted perception of happiness. Though the family still grapples with the pain and the outcome of the trial, they find solace in the knowledge that Paul is safe, beyond the reach of those who inflicted such cruelty, his memory cherished, and his spirit enduring. His story serves as an eternal warning, echoing through the corridors of time, about the moral obligations each of us bears, not only to ourselves, but to the inherent dignity of all human life. In this way, Paul's tragic end inspires a profound call for humanistic understanding and ethical conduct, advocating for a world where good triumphs over evil, not always swiftly, but ultimately and justly. This profound humanistic meaning resonates beyond the confines of the legal case, becoming a lesson for communities on the critical importance of integrity and respect in all human dealings, providing healthy entertainment that is thought-provoking and, above all, deeply inspires the ultimate victory of good.